The sun was beating down on the pavement, hot and unforgiving. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and rise off the concrete, blurring the tops of the buildings in the distance. But for the young woman sitting on the crate, the heat wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing was the smell. It was lunchtime in the city, and the air was thick with the aroma of frying garlic, melting butter, and fresh bread. It wafted out of every vent and doorway, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. Her stomach gave a loud, embarrassing growl. She pressed her hand against her belly, trying to quiet the sound, but it was no use. She was empty. She hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. She had survived on a few granola bars from a gas station and water from public fountains, but her body was demanding more now. She pulled her knees up closer to her chest, trying to make herself small. She was sitting behind a small stage area outside a place called the Blue Note Cafe. It was a trendy spot, the kind where people sat at round tables under large umbrellas and laughed while drinking expensive iced coffee. The woman felt invisible. She was wearing jeans that were fraying at the cuffs and a faded gray hoodie that had seen better days. Her backpack, stuffed with all her belongings, sat on the ground next to her. She watched the people. There was a man in a crisp blue suit typing furiously on a laptop. There was a couple sharing a dessert, looking happy. There were students with textbooks open, pretending to study but mostly talking. Everyone had a place to be. Everyone had food in front of them. Everyone except her. The woman's name was Ilora. She hadn't always been this hungry. She used to have a home, a room with walls, and a piano. But that felt like a lifetime ago. Now, her life was down to this one block, this one moment, and the desperate need to figure out how to get through the day. Her eyes drifted away from the diners and landed on the instrument sitting on the low stage. It was a digital piano. It wasn't a grand, gleaming beast made of polished wood and strings like the ones she remembered from her childhood. It was black and sleek, made of plastic and composite materials, with a stand that looked a bit wobbly. But to Ilora, it looked like a lifeline. She stared at the keys. They were black and white rectangles waiting to be touched. She knew exactly how they would feel. She knew the resistance of the plastic when you pressed it down, the slightly springy feel as it came back up. She knew that the lower notes would buzz a little through the floorboards and the high notes would cut through the noise of the traffic. Ilora reached into the pocket of her hoodie. Her fingers brushed against something crinkled and worn. She pulled it out. It was a photograph, folded over and over again until the creases were white and the paper was soft. She unfolded it carefully. It was a picture of a man sitting at a piano. He was hunched over, his back curved, his hands hovering over the keys like he was casting a spell. He looked intense, focused, and entirely lost in the music. The photo was black and white, taken a long time ago, but you could still feel the energy coming off him. This was Julian Vane. To the world, Julian had been a genius. They called him a prodigy, a master of the ivories. He had played in halls so big you had to whisper to be heard. He had composed music that made people cry without understanding why. But to Ilora, he was just Dad. He was the man who lived in the music room. Ilora looked at the photo, and a mix of sadness and warmth flooded her chest. She remembered sitting on the thick rug next to his piano bench. She wasn't allowed to touch the piano when he was playing serious music, so she would sit there, hugging her knees, listening. For hours, she would listen. She would watch his hands fly across the keys, a blur of motion. She didn't remember him teaching her scales. She didn't remember him sitting her down and explaining music theory. He was too busy with the genius inside his head. He was a complicated man, often tired, often distant. But she had learned anyway. She had learned by watching the curve of his fingers. She learned by hearing the rhythm in her sleep. She learned because the music was in the house they lived in. It was in the air she breathed. When he passed away, the house went quiet. The silence was louder than the music had ever been. Without the money he used to bring in, and without the drive to keep up the big empty house, things fell apart. Ilora tried to stay, but the reminders were too painful. So, she left. She took a bus to the city, hoping to find a new rhythm. But the city was loud and harsh, and it didn't care if she was the daughter of a genius. It only cared if you could pay rent. She put the photo back in her pocket, patting it flat. The hunger pang hit her again, sharper this time. It made her feel a bit dizzy. She looked at the keyboard on the stage, then back at the people eating their lunches. A thought started to form in her mind. It was a scary thought, the kind that made your heart beat faster. She knew she could play. She knew she had the music in her hands. She had watched her father for thousands of hours. She had memorized the way his hands moved. She had played his old piano in the empty house after he was gone, just to feel close to him. She wasn't a famous concert pianist. She didn't have a degree or a resume. But she had the blood of a genius running through her veins, and she had the skills to prove it. Maybe, she thought, just maybe, that was worth something. Maybe it was worth a meal. Ilora stood up slowly. Her legs felt a little stiff from sitting on the crate for so long. She brushed the dust off the back of her jeans. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The glass doors of the cafe were just a few feet away. She could see inside to the counter where the staff were moving around. She knew how this sounded. She knew what she looked like. A homeless girl asking for a favor. She could imagine the look in their eyes. She could imagine the polite refusal. But the hunger was stronger than the fear. The memory of her father, that intense look on his face in the photo, pushed her forward. He wouldn't be afraid, she thought. He would play. She looked at the digital piano one last time. It sat silent under the midday sun. It looked lonely up there on the stage, waiting for someone to bring it to life. Ilora flexed her fingers. They felt rough and dry, but underneath, she knew they were ready. Okay, she whispered to herself. It was the first word she had spoken out loud in hours. Her voice sounded raspy. She tightened the straps on her backpack and picked it up, swinging it over one shoulder. She walked toward the glass entrance of the Blue Note Cafe. She could hear the buzz of conversation inside, the clinking of silverware, and the hiss of the espresso machine. It was a world of normalcy that she was currently on the outside of. Ilora pushed her hair back behind her ears. She didn't have a plan B. This was it. She was going to walk in there and ask. She was going to offer the only thing she had left to give. It wasn't money. It wasn't labor. It was a gift that had been given to her, passed down from a father who didn't even know he was teaching her. Her hand reached for the metal handle of the glass door. The cold metal shocked her warm palm. She paused for a fraction of a second. If she opened this door, she was exposing herself. She was risking the last bit of pride she had left. But as her stomach rumbled again, reminding her of the basic need to survive, she pulled the handle. The bell above the door chimed a bright, cheerful chime that seemed to cut right through her anxiety. She stepped inside, leaving the bright heat of the street for the cool, shadowed interior of the cafe. The air conditioning hit her face, carrying the rich scent of roasted beans and sugar. Ilora stood just inside the doorway, letting her eyes adjust. The room was buzzing with life. No one looked up immediately. She was just another person entering the flow of traffic. But she wasn't there to eat and run. She was there to change her luck, one song at a time. She fixed her eyes on the counter, where a man with a towel slung over his shoulder was busy clearing plates. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and began to walk toward him. Ilora walked up to the long counter, feeling her sneakers squeak slightly on the polished floor. The closer she got, the more out of place she felt. The people sitting at the high tables near the window were dressed in crisp shirts and blouses. They had expensive watches and neatly styled hair. She looked down at her own faded jeans and the tips of her sneakers, which were starting to peel away from the soles. Behind the counter stood a man who looked like he was in charge. He was a big guy, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been set in a permanent frown. He had a white towel thrown over one shoulder and was wiping down the counter with a fast, aggressive motion. His name tag simply said Tony. Ilora waited for a moment. Tony was busy shouting an order to the kitchen, his voice booming over the noise of the coffee grinder. "Table 4 needs that avocado toast now. And don't be stingy with the pepper." He slammed his hand on the counter to emphasize the point. Ilora swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry and tight. She gripped the strap of her backpack tighter. She knew she had to speak up, but the fear was like a heavy stone in her stomach. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was so quiet that it was instantly swallowed by the noise of the cafe. Tony didn't even look up. He just kept wiping the counter, moving a stack of sugar packets from left to right. Ilora took a small step closer. She tried again, forcing her voice to be a little louder. "Excuse me. Tony." This time, Tony heard. He stopped wiping and looked up. His eyes were small and tired, and he looked right through her at first, as if she were part of the scenery. Then he focused on her clothes, on the backpack, and on the fact that she wasn't there to order a $10 coffee. "We don't allow soliciting here," he said abruptly. "No flyers, no charity donations, no signature collecting." "No, I'm not selling anything," Ilora said quickly, shaking her head. She felt her cheeks getting hot. I saw the piano outside." Tony raised an eyebrow. He looked past her, out the glass window to the stage area where the digital keyboard sat. "Yeah, what about it?" "I was wondering," Ilora started, and she had to pause to take a shaky breath. "I was wondering if I could play it. Just for a little while." Tony let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh, it was a laugh of disbelief. "Play it? You want to play the piano?" Ilora nodded. "Yes. I play." "Look, kid," Tony said, leaning his heavy arms on the counter. He smelled strongly of coffee grounds and stale cologne. "This isn't a public park. That piano is for the musicians we hire. Professionals. People who have auditioned and have resumes. You can't just walk in off the street and start making noise." "I won't make noise," Ilora promised him. "I know how to play. Really well." "I bet you do," Tony said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He looked over at a man sitting at the bar nearby. The man was in a business suit, typing on a tablet. "Hey, listen to this. She wants to play the piano." The man in the suit looked up. He had a drink in front of him with a little umbrella in it. He looked Ilora up and down, a smirk forming on his face. "Is this a joke?" She wants to know if she can play a tune, Tony said, grinning now. He seemed to enjoy the entertainment at her expense. Well, we could use some dinner music, the man in the suit said, chuckling. He turned to a woman sitting a few seats away, a lady in a bright blazer who was eating a salad. Hey, look. We have a volunteer pianist. The lady put down her fork and looked at Elora. She didn't seem angry, exactly, just amused. She looked at Elora the way people look at a puppy that is trying to walk on its hind legs. Oh, let her play, the lady said, waving a hand dismissively. Maybe she knows chopsticks. That's about the extent of street performers, isn't it? A few more people nearby overheard the conversation. A young couple in the corner whispered to each other and laughed. Elora felt her face burning. It felt like her skin was on fire. She felt small. She felt foolish. But she also felt something else, a spark of anger. Not a hot, violent anger, but a cold, steady feeling in her chest. She didn't know these people. They didn't know her father. They didn't know the years she spent sitting in silence, absorbing the genius that lived in their house. I don't know chopsticks, Elora said. Her voice didn't shake this time. She looked directly at Tony. I know classical pieces. Complicated ones. I just want to play for you. If you let me play, and you don't like it, I'll leave. But if I play well, could I have a meal, just a plate of food? Anything. Tony stared at her. The laughter in his eyes died down a little, replaced by annoyance. He looked at the line of people waiting to order coffee. He looked at the clock on the wall. He was short-staffed, and his scheduled musician had called in sick an hour ago. The lunch rush was loud, and the place felt chaotic. Usually, the piano music helped calm people down, got them to order desserts and stay longer. He looked at the girl again. She looked dirty, tired, and desperate. But her eyes were steady. She wasn't looking at the floor anymore. She was looking right at him, challenging him. I'm not running a soup kitchen, kid, Tony said gruffly. I can't just give away food. I'm not asking for a handout, Elora said firmly. I'm offering to work. I'm offering to entertain your customers. If I'm terrible, you lose nothing. You can kick me out. But if I'm good, you get live music for free, and I get to eat. Tony sighed loudly. He rubbed his hand over his face, scratching the stubble on his chin. He looked at the piano again. The plastic cover was still on it. It looked sad sitting there in the middle of the patio. One song, Tony said, pointing a thick finger at her. You get one song. And if you bang on those keys like a monkey, I'm calling the cops. I don't have time for nonsense. I won't bang, Elora said. And keep it short, the man in the suit called out from his stool. Some of us are trying to work here. Yeah, don't break our eardrums, added the lady with the salad. Elora ignored them. She felt a strange calm wash over her. The deal was struck. It wasn't a good deal, and the odds were stacked against her, but it was a chance. That was all she needed. She turned around and walked toward the glass exit. She could feel their eyes on her back. She could feel the judgment. They were waiting for her to fail. They were waiting for her to make a fool of herself so they could laugh and go back to their sandwiches and their laptops. She pushed the handle on the glass panel. The cool air of the cafe rushed out past her, replaced by the humid warmth of the afternoon. The noise of the city traffic, sirens, shouting greeted her. But it felt different now. She wasn't just walking back into the noise. She was walking toward a battle. She stepped onto the patio. The stage was only a few feet away. It looked higher up than it had before. The digital piano sat there, shiny and black, reflecting the sunlight. The keys were white, blindingly bright. Ilora walked up the 3 steps. The wood creaked under her sneakers. She stood in front of the bench. She took off her backpack and dropped it gently onto the floor behind the piano. She sat down. The bench was a little hard, a little slippery. She adjusted her position. She was close enough to the edge of the stage that she could see the people sitting at the tables nearest to her. They were watching her with smug expressions, sipping their drinks, waiting for the show to begin. Ilora looked at her hands. They were shaking slightly. She took a deep breath and held them out, palms down, shaking them loose to get the tension out. She closed her eyes for a moment. She blocked out the sun. She blocked out the traffic. She blocked out the man in the suit and the lady with the salad. In the darkness of her mind, she saw the picture in her pocket. She saw her father. She saw the intense focus in his eyes. She remembered the sound of the piano in the living room late at night. She remembered the feeling of the music vibrating through the floorboards. "You are a vain," she told herself. "This is in your blood." She opened her eyes. She placed her left hand on the keys. Her fingers felt the familiar texture of the plastic. She placed her right hand on the keys. She paused. The chatter of the lunch crowd was loud, a constant wave of noise. Ilora didn't wait for the room to get quiet. She knew that once the first note sounded, everything else would disappear. She took a breath, held it for a split second, and then let her fingers fall. The moment her fingers touched the keys, the air around the stage seemed to shift. It wasn't a loud crash or a bang, but a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. Ilora struck a chord, a heavy C minor that hung in the humid air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The digital piano, usually a tinny, electric-sounding box, suddenly seemed to have a heartbeat. For the first few seconds, the lunch crowd didn't react. The man in the suit kept typing on his tablet. The lady with the salad took a bite of a cherry tomato. The couple in the corner continued their conversation. To them, this was just the noise starting, the clumsy beginning of a street performance they would ignore. They were expecting a simple melody, maybe Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or a messy pop song. But then, Ilora's left hand began to move. It crawled down the keyboard in a steady, ominous rhythm. It was a sound that demanded attention, a bass line that was dark and serious. It wasn't background music anymore. It was a statement. The typing at the bar stopped. The man in the suit paused, his fingers hovering over his screen. He frowned, looking up toward the stage. That didn't sound like an amateur. That sounded like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Ilora didn't look at the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on her hands, but her mind was far away. She was back in that dim living room, watching the shadows dance on the walls as her father practiced. She remembered the specific way his wrist would drop, the weight he would put into the low notes to make them sing. She mimicked that motion now. She poured the weight of her hunger, her loneliness, and her tiredness into those keys. Suddenly, her right hand sprang into action. It wasn't a simple tune. It was a cascade of notes, a waterfall of sound that flowed from the middle of the piano up to the high notes. It was fast, impossibly fast, but every note was clear. There was no mashing of keys, no blurring of the sound. It was precise. It was sharp. The sound cut through the clatter of silverware and the hiss of the espresso machine like a knife. Heads began to turn. The woman with the salad lowered her fork slowly, her eyes widening. She stopped chewing. The teenagers at the corner table looked up from their phones, confusion replacing their boredom. They were hearing something that didn't belong on a street corner. It sounded like a concert hall. Ilora played a run of notes that climbed higher and higher, growing tense and anxious. It felt like a chase, like running through a forest and not knowing where to go. Her fingers moved with a mind of their own, guided by the muscle memory she had built over years of silent listening. She didn't have to think about where the next note was. Her hands knew the path. They were playing the music of her blood, the legacy of the father she had lost. Inside the cafe, Tony was standing by the coffee machine. He had been wiping a pitcher, but his hand had stopped moving. He looked out the window, his face blank. He had been ready to drag the girl off the stage the moment she made a mistake. He had his hand on the phone to call security if things got weird. But now, he couldn't move. He knew music. He owned a music cafe, after all. He heard hundreds of singers and guitar players every week. Most were okay. Some were bad. A rare few were good. But this was different. This girl wasn't just playing the notes, she was attacking them with a ferocity that was scary. There was a passion in the playing that you couldn't learn in a school. It sounded raw, like it was being ripped out of her soul. On the patio, the atmosphere had completely changed. The smug looks were gone. The people who had been laughing moments ago were now sitting in silence. The noise of the city, the cars, the sirens, the construction seemed to fade away, pushed to the background by the sheer power of the piano. Ilora's body swayed slightly with the music. She wasn't sitting stiff anymore. She was leaning into the instrument, her shoulders moving with the rhythm. The song was complex, full of twists and turns. It went from soft and whispery to loud and thunderous in the blink of an eye. She played a section of fast, repeating chords that sounded like the beating of a giant heart. The man in the business suit closed his tablet. He pushed it to the side of the table, giving the stage his full attention. He knew enough about music to know that what he was hearing was difficult. Very difficult. His eyes traced the girl's movements. She looked so small up there, hunched over the keyboard, but the sound she was creating was massive. It was hard to believe that sound was coming from her. The piece she was playing was one of her father's favorites. It was a nocturne, but she was playing it with a strength that her father never had. His version had been sad and distant. Her version was desperate. It was the sound of someone fighting for survival. Every chord was a plea. Every high note was a cry for help. As the song reached its middle section, the tempo slowed down. The aggressive bass line softened, turning into a gentle, flowing river of sound. Ilora's hands moved gracefully now, caressing the keys rather than striking them. The melody was beautiful, achingly sweet. It made people think of lost love and missed chances. A woman sitting near the front, a mother with a stroller, felt tears prick her eyes. She didn't know why. The music just touched something inside her, something deep and buried. She looked at the girl's face. It was intense, focused, but there was a single tear running down her cheek, mixing with the grime and the dust. The mother put her hand over her heart. She realized this wasn't just a performance. This was personal. Ilora didn't care about the audience anymore. She didn't care if they were impressed or if they were laughing. She was playing for the photo in her pocket. She was playing for the years of silence in her house. She was playing to prove to herself that she was still here, that she hadn't disappeared. The digital piano's speakers vibrated against the stage floor. The sound was rich and full, filling the outdoor patio. Even the people walking past on the sidewalk stopped. They stood near the railing, watching through the gaps in the hedge, listening. A small crowd was forming on the street, drawn in by the music. Inside, the staff had stopped working. The baristas were standing still, cups in hand, looking out the window. Even the kitchen staff had come to the pass-through window, wiping their hands on their aprons, listening to the girl who could play. Tony felt a chill run down his arms, despite the warm afternoon. He looked at the girl's hands. They were a blur. She was playing a section of the song that was incredibly technical, a maze of notes that most pianists would stumble over. She didn't stumble once. Her fingers danced over the keys with a confidence that was terrifying. He remembered his first thought, that she was just a beggar looking for a handout. He felt a sudden wave of shame wash over him. He looked at the half-eaten meals on the tables, the expensive drinks, and then at the girl in the faded hoodie. She had more talent in her pinky finger than most of the people he hired. The music began to build again. It was climbing toward the end. The softness vanished, replaced by a mounting tension. The volume grew. The chords became thicker, more complex. Ilora was pouring everything she had left into the finale. She played with a force that made her whole body shake. She was fighting the piano, wrestling the music out of it, demanding it to be heard. The people on the patio were leaning forward in their seats. No one was eating. No one was drinking. The silence was absolute, except for the booming of the piano. It was as if the whole world had paused to listen to this one girl. The man in the suit shook his head slowly, a look of pure disbelief on his face. He whispered, "Who is she?" The lady with the salad forgot about her diet. She forgot about her conference call. She just stared. She had never heard anything like this in a coffee shop. It felt like she should have bought a ticket and sat in a velvet seat to hear this. Ilora's fingers flew across the high notes, playing a fast, intricate run that sounded like glass shattering. Then, with a sudden, dramatic motion, she brought both hands down to the low end of the keyboard. She struck the final chords. 3 massive, resonant chords that rang out like church bells. Done. 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 And then, silence. She didn't lift her hands immediately. She kept them pressed on the keys, letting the vibration hum through her fingers. Her chest was heaving. She was out of breath, as if she had just run a marathon. The air around the stage seemed to shimmer with the ghost of the music. For 5 long seconds, no one moved. The city noise seemed to rush back in all at once. A car horn honked, a dog barked, but the people on the patio remained frozen. They were stunned. They were looking at the stage, trying to process what they had just heard. The girl who looked like a beggar had just played like a master. The silence was heavy, heavy with the weight of their own judgment, which was now crashing down on them. They knew they had been wrong. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, like a blanket being pulled over a noisy room. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the traffic on the street seemed to fade away for a moment, unable to compete with the ghost of the music that still hung in the air. Ilora's hands remained on the keys, her head bowed low. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling with the effort of playing so intensely. Inside the cafe, the espresso machine hissed loudly, breaking the spell, but the people on the patio didn't flinch. They were still staring at the small figure on the stage. Then, the sound started. It wasn't a polite golf clap. It began with the man in the business suit. He slowly stood up, his chair scraping against the concrete, and brought his hands together. Once. Twice. Then, he started clapping harder, a genuine smile breaking across his face. It was like a dam breaking. The lady with the salad put her fork down and began to clap. The couple in the corner joined in. Soon, the entire patio was filled with the sound of applause. It wasn't just noise, it was a roar of appreciation. Strangers were smiling at each other, nodding their heads as if they had just witnessed something miraculous. They were sharing a moment of connection, brought together by a girl they had tried to ignore just 10 minutes ago. Ilora slowly pulled her hands away from the keyboard. The sudden absence of the vibrating keys felt strange to her fingers. She sat up straighter and blinked, looking out at the crowd. The harsh reality of the sun and the faces hit her all at once. She wasn't in a concert hall, she was still on a wooden crate stage in the middle of a city. But the look on their faces was different now. The smugness was gone. The judgment had vanished. In its place was something she hadn't seen in a long time: respect. Inside, Tony was standing by the window, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the applause, then down at his hands. He felt a strange burning in his chest. It wasn't heartburn. It was guilt. He remembered the way he had laughed at her. He remembered the cruel things he had said, the way he had treated her like a nuisance. He looked at the girl, sitting there so small and alone, and realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had judged a book by its cover, and the story inside had turned out to be a masterpiece. Tony pushed through the glass exit, marching toward the stage. The crowd parted for him, the applause still echoing off the brick walls of the cafe. He stopped at the edge of the stage, looking up at Ilora. She looked back at him, guarded, waiting for him to tell her to get lost, to say that even a good song wasn't enough to change the rules. That was. Tony started, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his tough guy composure, but it was useless. The music had stripped that away. That was incredible, he said, his voice much softer than before. Thank you, Ilora whispered. Her voice was hoarse. I mean it, Tony said, stepping up onto the stage. The crowd quieted down, listening to what he would say. I've been running this place for 10 years. I've heard a lot of pianists. Professionals. Guys with degrees from fancy schools. None of them played like that. Where did you learn? Ilora looked down at her shoes. She didn't want to explain about her father. It was too personal, too painful. I just listened a lot, she said simply. My father, he knew music. He must have been a genius, Tony said. He shook his head in disbelief. You've got a gift, kid. A serious gift. The man in the business suit stepped closer to the stage. Excuse me, he said. He didn't sound arrogant anymore. He sounded eager. I have to ask. Was that an original composition or something classical? It felt familiar, but new. It's a mix, Ilora said, feeling a bit shy under his intense gaze. It's based on a nocturne, but I changed the middle part. I added some things. Well, you should write it down, the man said firmly. People would pay to hear that. I would pay to hear that. Ilora looked at him, surprised. For so long, her music had been a secret, a burden she carried alone. The idea that people would actually pay for it seemed foreign. Tony clapped his hands loudly, bringing everyone's attention back to him. All right, give her some space. She's not a statue in a museum. He turned back to Elora. We had a deal. You played, and if I liked it, well, I think it's safe to say I liked it. Elora felt a flutter of hope in her chest. Does that mean? That means you get a meal, Tony said. And not just a scrap from the kitchen. You get the good stuff. He looked over at the lady with the salad. Hey, what are you eating that looks good? It's the grilled salmon with asparagus, the lady said, smiling warmly. And the lemon butter sauce. You heard the lady, Tony said to Elora. Salmon. Asparagus. Lemon butter. And a soda. Or water. Whatever you want. On the house. Elora's eyes widened. She hadn't had salmon in years. She couldn't even remember the last time she had a meal that wasn't out of a can or a wrapper. Thank you, she said, the words rushing out. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet, Tony grunted, but there was a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You earned it? Come on inside. Elora stood up. She felt a little dizzy as her blood pressure adjusted. She reached down to grab her backpack, but Tony stopped her. Leave it, he said. I'll have one of the guys watch it. Nobody's going to touch it out here. She hesitated, but then let go of the strap. It felt good to unburden her shoulders. She followed Tony off the stage and toward the glass exit. As she walked through the tables, people reached out. They didn't touch her, but they waved, or gave her a thumbs up. Beautiful, one woman whispered. Amazing talent, said a man with a gray beard. Elora didn't know how to react to the praise. She just nodded her head, a small, shy smile touching her lips for the first time that day. She walked back into the cool air of the cafe, but this time, the air didn't feel hostile. It felt welcoming. Tony led her to a small table in the corner, a spot that was usually reserved for reserved signs. Sit here, he said. I'll tell the kitchen to rush your order. Elora sat down. The chair was soft and cushioned. She sank into it, letting her muscles relax. For the first time in hours, she wasn't standing or walking or worrying about where to go. She just sat. She watched Tony walk over to the counter. He spoke to one of the baristas, a young guy with bright green hair. Tony pointed over at Elora. The barista looked at her, his eyes wide, and then nodded enthusiastically. Tony went into the kitchen, and a moment later, the chef came out, wiping his hands on his apron. He looked at Elora, gave her a nod of respect, and disappeared back inside. Elora looked around the cafe. The patrons who were inside had come to the window to watch her performance, and now they were turning back to their tables. But they kept glancing over at her. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was part of the room. She put her hand in her pocket and pulled out the photograph of her father. She unfolded it on the table. She looked at his face, intense and focused. In the past, looking at the photo made her sad. It reminded her of what she had lost. But today, looking at it, she felt a different kind of feeling. She felt connected. You would have liked this, Dad, she whispered softly to the picture. They clapped. They really clapped. She imagined him sitting there in the empty chair across from her. She could almost hear his voice, gruff but proud. Not bad, kid. But you rushed the tempo, he would probably say. Elora smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek and landing on the laminated tabletop. She wiped it away quickly. A few minutes later, Tony came back carrying a large plate. He set it down in front of her with a thud. The smell was incredible. There was a perfectly grilled piece of salmon, steaming hot, sitting on a bed of rice. Next to it were bright green asparagus spears, all drizzled with a rich, yellow sauce. There was even a small slice of lemon on the side. Next to the plate was a tall glass of ice water with a slice of lemon in it. "Here we go," Tony said, placing a fork and knife wrapped in a napkin next to the plate. "The Blue Note Special." Ilora stared at the food. It looked like a painting. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "It smells wonderful," she said. "Eat up," Tony said. He started to walk away, but then he paused. He looked back at her, his face serious. "Listen, kid. I don't know your story. I don't know where you're sleeping tonight. But if you can play like that, you shouldn't be hungry. You shouldn't be struggling." Ilora picked up her fork, her hand trembling slightly. "It's hard," she said. "Getting started. Nobody listens." "I know," Tony said. "Well, I listened today, and you've got a table here whenever you want it, as long as you promise to play a few tunes." Ilora looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Really?" "Really," Tony nodded. "We could use a little class around here." He walked back to the counter, leaving her alone with her meal. Ilora didn't wait. She cut off a piece of the salmon. It was flaky and tender. She put it in her mouth. The flavor exploded, buttery, salty, fresh. It tasted better than anything she remembered. It tasted like survival. It tasted like hope. She took another bite, and another. The hunger that had been gnawing at her stomach all day began to subside, replaced by a warm, comfortable feeling. As she ate, she watched the people in the cafe. They were laughing, talking, working. It was a normal day for them. But for her, the world had shifted. She had walked in a stranger, but she was leaving as something else. She wasn't just a girl with a backpack anymore. She was a musician. She was Julian Vane's daughter. And she had finally found her own voice. Ilora scraped the last bit of sauce from the plate with her fork, savoring the final taste of the meal. It was strange how good food could change everything. Only 20 minutes ago, she had felt weak, dizzy, and small. Now, the warmth of the salmon and the fresh water had spread through her body, pushing back the cold edge of hunger. She felt steady. Her hands had stopped shaking. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the strength to face the world. She took the paper napkin from her lap and wiped her mouth. She looked at the empty plate, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. It wasn't just about the calories. It was about the kindness. Tony hadn't just given her food, he had treated her like a human being. He had given her a seat at a real table, not a spot on the sidewalk. She pushed her chair back and stood up. The cafe was still busy, the afternoon rush picking up again as people came in for their late coffees and meetings. Ilora picked up her backpack, swinging it over one shoulder. It felt lighter than before. She walked toward the counter to find Tony. He was busy making a drink, the espresso machine steaming loudly, but he saw her coming. He finished the order, handed the cup to a customer, and then turned to her. He leaned his elbows on the counter, looking tired but content. "You finish it all?" Tony asked, nodding toward the table she had just left. "Every bite," Ilora said. "It was the best thing I've ever eaten." "Thank you." "I'm glad," Tony said. He wiped a spot on the counter with his towel. "You look a little better. Color's coming back to your cheeks." "I feel better," Ilora said. She hesitated for a moment, twisting the strap of her backpack. I should get going. I don't want to overstay my welcome. Tony frowned. You don't have to run off, you know. We don't close for hours. I know, Ilora said softly. But I need to figure out my night. She didn't want to say that she didn't have a place to sleep. She didn't want to ruin the nice moment by bringing up the reality of her life on the streets. She wanted to hold on to the dignity she felt while sitting at that table. Tony understood. He saw the look in her eyes, the look of someone who has been surviving for too long. He didn't press her. All right. But listen, he said. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small business card. He wrote a number on the back of it with a black marker. If you need anything, or if you want to talk about playing here again properly, with pay you call this number. Or you just walk in the back. Okay. Ilora took the card. It was warm from his hand. She held it tight, like it was made of gold. I will, she promised. Good luck, kid, Tony said. And hey, keep playing. I will, she said again. Ilora turned and walked toward the glass exit. As she pushed the handle, the cool afternoon air hit her face. It wasn't as hot as earlier, but the sun was still bright. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. The patio was full again, new people sitting at the tables where the audience had clapped for her. They didn't know who she was. They were just drinking their coffee and looking at their phones. To them, she was just another girl walking by. She walked a few steps away from the cafe and found a quiet spot near a brick wall, out of the flow of the foot traffic. She leaned against the rough bricks and slid her backpack to the ground. She needed a moment to process everything that had happened. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph of her father. The sunlight hit the black and white image, making the edges of the paper glow. She looked at Julian's face. He looked so serious, so locked in his own world. For years, she had been angry at him for leaving her, and for being so distant when he was alive. She felt like he had given her his talent but none of his attention. But standing there, with a full stomach and the sound of applause still ringing in her ears, she realized something. He had given her more than just talent. He had given her a way out. He had given her a voice that she could use when she had nothing else. The music wasn't just his legacy, it was hers now. She had taken it, and she had used it to survive. She had used it to feed herself. I did it, Dad, she whispered to the photo. A single tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She let it dry in the sun. They laughed at first. Just like you used to say people would. But then they listened. She thought about the man in the suit and the lady with the salad. They had looked at her with such pity, and then with such respect. She had changed how they saw her, just by playing one song. It was a powerful feeling. Ilora carefully folded the photograph and put it back in her pocket, right next to Tony's business card. The card felt like a lifeline. It was a bridge between her life on the street and a life where she could be a musician. She wasn't sure what would happen tomorrow. She still didn't have a home. She still didn't have money for a hotel room. But for the first time, she had a plan. She had a direction. She picked up her backpack. The weight on her shoulders felt different now. It wasn't a burden dragging her down, it was just her gear. She stood up tall, stretching her spine. She looked up at the sky. It was a brilliant blue, with a few fluffy clouds drifting by. Ilora took a deep breath of the city air. It still smelled like car exhaust and garbage, mixed with the scent of coffee and pastry. But underneath it all, she could smell possibility. She wasn't just a homeless girl anymore. She was Ilora, the daughter of a genius, and a musician in her own right. She turned away from the cafe and started walking down the street. Her steps were steady and sure. She didn't know exactly where she was going to sleep tonight, maybe a park, maybe a shelter. But it didn't scare her as much as it had this morning. She had her music. She had her father's memory. And she had the knowledge that she could make people listen. As she walked, she began to hum a melody. It was a new tune, one she was making up in her head as her sneakers hit the pavement. It was light and hopeful, with a bouncy rhythm. It was the sound of tomorrow. A block away, she passed a street musician playing a guitar on the corner. He had an open case on the ground for tips. Usually, Ilora would have looked away, feeling sorry for him because she was in the same boat. But today, she stopped. She dropped the dollar coin she had found in her pocket earlier into his case. The musician looked up, surprised, and nodded at her. Ilora smiled back. "Good luck," she said. "You too," the musician replied. She kept walking. The city was huge and loud, full of millions of people. It was easy to get lost in a place like this. But Ilora didn't feel lost anymore. She had found her center. She had found that the piano wasn't just a thing made of wood and wire. It was a bridge between people. It was a way to say, "I am here. I matter." The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The street lights flickered on, ready for the evening. Ilora walked into the golden light of the setting sun. Her stomach was full, her heart was full, and her hands were ready to play whatever song came next. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And she knew, deep down, that her father was proud.